Hi everyone, welcome to another exciting edition of Words, Images, and Worlds. They're always exciting. I'm always excited to be here and glad on this episode to be talking with comics creator Tom McWeeney. Tom, thank you for jumping in, joining, and talking with me for a few minutes today.
All right, thanks for having me.
Yeah, my pleasure. I usually start out by mentioning a couple of titles that people out there might know you for. We could spend a whole episode just listing titles, but I'll mention, of course, the Fantastic Four, Grifter, the Demon, Gen 13, and then you've also worked in the world of toy design, I believe, as well.
Yeah, that's my main
Official
bread and butter.
question. What took you to the world of comics? How did you decide it was the space you wanted to be in?
I didn't decide it decided for me. I told the story before, but when I was a kid, there was a woman across the street who had an older son. He was like in his 20s and he was moving out of the house. And my mother had four boys. So as she was cleaning up his house, the woman brought over this big cardboard box full of comics that this guy had.
Hmm.
And you know, it was all filled with like late 50s, early 60s DC comics. So it was all like that goofy sort of like Mort Weisinger period where, uh, Batman would be on a street corner holding a can begging for money on the cover of one issue, and then just silly Superman would be an Indian chief on the next issue.
Hmm. Hmm.
But in that box was one Marvel comic. It was a Tales to Astonish, and I was just so struck by how different it was than all the DC comics. It
Yeah.
was Tales to Astonish. It was the Hulk and the Submariner. No costumes on either of them. The Hulk was basically his, just a monster, and that really appealed to me as a kid who was, totally into monster movies at the time. And that was it. And then I started, I was fascinated by those books, and then another stroke of luck was right across the street to me, next to that woman. This kid moved in who was a big comic nerd,
Hmm. Hmm.
and he also had grandparents that spoiled him. So he had a pretty good collection already starting out. So I got exposed to things I wouldn't have otherwise. I didn't have a lot of money, so I couldn't buy a lot of books. So he had like big runs of like Spider-Man and Fantastic Four, and we became fast friends over that.
Hmm.
And I was pretty lucky in that there was within a few year period, there was also two other people in my neighborhood, sort of within walking distance of my house, who were comic fans. One guy was the first sort of diehard collector I ever saw. Like
Hmm.
I bought my comics and I read them until the cover came off. And when I went over to this one guy's house, this one kid, he had bagged, boarded in boxes. Like I had never seen anything like this. I hadn't been to a comic convention yet. Like, and I was like, really? Like, this seems excessive to me. Do you read them? And he did read them. He was familiar clearly, but so I got very lucky that I had this sort of circle of people that were kind of into it. And I had an older brother that drew and drew very well.
Hmm.
So the sort of meeting of comics, which was an art related medium, and watching my brother draw, I was like, oh, I'm going to try to do what he does, but I'm going to try and draw this stuff. We always had uh, Mad Magazine around the house. We always had,
Hmm.
a lot of like comic strip trade paperbacks, particularly Dennis the Menace was a popular one. So there was a lot of early exposure, and I think that's why I say it chose me. It was just, you know, it was a no brainer really, and I always actually remember the exact sort of moment where I said to myself, "This is what I want to do for a living," which was when I was in sixth grade.
Hmm.
It was early in the school year, so I really, people are sort of getting to know each other in the classroom. And during one of our breaks, I started to draw from memory the Hulk. And some kid came over and leaned over my shoulder and was like he couldn't believe that I was not copying, you know, the character. And
Yeah.
he said something, praising me, and I was like, this is the greatest thing ever. And then that was it. And I was like, you know what? This is really what I want to do. And that was pretty much the moment.
Some kind words from a classmate that go a long way, right? Like totally.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I was very lucky. My parents never dissuaded me. Well, again, and I had my older brother who was always better than me, but that was great because it made me I want to draw that well.
Hmm.
It gave me a sort of realistic sense. I think that's another thing too, is I've always had a pretty good idea of how good or how bad I really am at a given time in my career. And I
Hmm.
think that was from being around my brother. And then when I got into high school, um, my high school had a really good art program, which is, pretty shocking, where you actually had to be picked to be put in the art major program. And there was a guy in there, this guy, Dan Platt, who, again, can't thank enough for him being in my class, who was just um, so much better than any high school kid had the right to be.
Hmm.
Like he was just really could just draw. Like, granted, he copied a lot from photographs, but he also was very good. Like, the stuff was really solid. And being around Dan changed my thinking completely on how he was the first person I saw who drew. And while he was drawing and doing art, he was very serious about it. Like, he
Hmm.
was not like rubbing his chin, you know. He just took the act of drawing very serious. Like, he would sit down, he would get very engrossed in it. He would talk, it wasn't like that, but you could see he just this was it. This was what he was doing. He's going to make this look as good as he can.
Hmm.
He's going to put as much effort in as is possible. And that was it. Because prior to that, I was just drawing in sketchbooks, doodling, look at this drawing I did. Isn't it funny? It it really was eye opening and just completely changed how I looked at it. I was like, I gotta be more like Dan if
Hmm.
I'm gonna make a go of this, because this is what it takes. Like, it was just so clear that he was going to be successful. I knew it, and he was. And so those, I've always had very good luck with these sort of things that came my way at
Hmm.
particular points in my career. And I can't underestimate how important it was. And he was a great guy. Like, he was a
Yeah.
really nice guy. Like, so and he was one of those guys that, like, I was very like, I don't know if I should do this. And he was the total opposite. Like, we decided in our junior year we were going to make stop motion animated film. And
Hmm.
I'm like, I don't know how to do that. And Dan was like, don't worry, we'll figure it out. And so he'd go get a camera, and he had a grandfather who worked at a machine shop, who made us, like, literally, he took a photograph to his grandfather of the original King Kong armature, just a picture, like, out of a magazine, and said, "Hey, Gramps, can you make me a few of these?" Sure. He made us like 7 of them, like ball
Wow.
bearing metal aluminum armatures, exactly to specification, just by eyeballing it. And that was Dan. Like, Dan was the same way. Like, he was completely uninhibited by anything. Like, sure, oh, we need to build a set for this movie we're going to make. I'd go over there 2 weeks later. He'd have cleared out a section of his room, and there'd be sawhorses with a piece of plywood, and he'd have bags and bags of plaster of Paris. We're going to make a set.
Ah.
And that was it. Then we'd spend that afternoon making the set for that movie. And being around that kind of energy was
Hmm.
great. Very, very important, because at that age, you're in high school, you don't really know. A lot of self-doubt can creep in. And being
Hmm.
around Dan, it was like impossible to for that to happen, you know.
Yeah. Yeah. Professionally in comics, any collaborations that kind of sparked that way for you as you look back across your career?
Well, I mean, the most pivotal one was my first one, which was Rich Hedden on Roachmill.
Hmm. Hmm.
I met Rich at the Cubert School. He was in my class, and sort of. early in third year, um, it's your final year. You know you're going to be at the end of the year, sort of sending portfolios around, trying to get work. Um, the one thing I was very struck about Rich, like you know, he was not the best artist in the class. He did not draw as well as a lot of other guys. But Rich had something that none of the rest of them had, which is Rich had a writer's mind. Like
Mm-hmm.
Rich drew comics with a writer's, and I don't mean dialogue. I don't mean he approached every story from a plot point of view. And
Mm-hmm.
again, this was new to me. To me, it was always, oh, you start with the character. What character am I doing? Oh, I'm going to do a story with Spider-Man. Okay, who am I going to have him? What's the conflict going to be? It's going to be Dr. Octopus. Rich never started his stories from that point. He always started it from like, what if this happened in this story?
Mm-hmm.
And how can we take that, do it and turn it on its head? Like, how can we do it so that it's done in a different way and sort of surprises the reader? And this was, again, just like I was talking about with Dan, was brand new to me. Like, I'm like, all my ability to do any kind of writing to this day comes directly from working with Rich on Roachmill. He had just a really innate sense of like how to plot and pace a story.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so I sort of like, halfway through the year, I said, um, we should work together. The comics industry was changing pretty drastically. It was 1986,
Mm-hmm.
and comic companies were springing up overnight. We weren't hemmed into the, oh, we have to graduate the Cubert School and start submitting stuff to Marvel and DC. And I said to him, let's just work on something. I also think we both kind of knew we were not ready for Marvel and DC. Either of us, we weren't good enough. So I said, let's pitch something to one of these smaller companies and see what happens. And he, I'll never forget it. Oh, he's like, yeah, I got an idea. And I'm like, really? I was like, yeah. And he's like, it's called Roachmill. And I'm like, okay. And he says, yeah, it takes place in the future, and a guy runs a pest control business. And I'm like, okay. And he's like, yeah, but in the future, like, you can hire him and he could come to your house and he can kill like your roaches or your rats in your basement, but he could also kill like your annoying mother-in-law or, the neighbor upstairs who's making too much noise. And that just cracked me up. And I was like, oh my God, that's brilliant. Like, it's just so dark. And so, that was it. As soon as that's all he had to tell me. And I was like, okay, that's the book we should work on. And that's how sort of Roachmill was born in a couple sentences. He pitched it to me, and um, but like I said, that's the way Rich thought, which was,
Mm-hmm.
oh, he could be a pest control guy, but what could be different about it? What's the wrinkle in it? And
Yeah.
and he was always really good at stuff like that. Um, so yeah, so I owe a lot to Rich, especially I will say this, especially too with doing comedy in comics.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Making humorous comics is hard. Humor works much better in animation where things can happen really fast, and you know, but doing humor in comics is tough. And Rich was really good at it. And Rich was really good at it in that he never lost sight of the fact that it's a visual medium.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you can you can have the characters saying funny things in a panel, but that's not going to be half as good as if they're doing funny things. And so he took full advantage of the visual aspects of it, and it was always sort of character based humor, having characters do things you don't expect or whatnot. And you know that I learned all that from Rich.
Nice. Nice. Uh, you talked about Roachmill. Curious about other particular titles that you would point people to.
um well, I mean, I worked on Roachmill, and then we weren't making any money on it. And eventually we just decided it was time to try and get some money. And we, through a sort of series of circumstances, got very lucky, and we wound up on the Demon at DC. And we
Mm-hmm.
were,
Mm-hmm.
contracted to do a year of the Demon, so 12 issues. And very early on in that, it just didn't really work out for Rich. Like he was used to plotting, writing, drawing, and now all of a sudden he was basically just the pencil on a book. And I think he really struggled with that. He had um, you could sort of see the fun go out of it for him by issue 3 or 4 into it, and we still had, you know, 8, 9 issues left to go.
Mhm.
And so while we were on the Demon, I think just became kind of a thing where he realized that, or I don't know if he realized it, but I realized that this wasn't really what he was cut out to do. He was more of a creator owned guy.
Mhm.
And so when that was done, we parted ways. I did a couple jobs for DC for um, about a year. I worked on a book called Damage, and the editor on that book was Bill Kaplan. And one day I got a call from Bill, and he said, DC's going to offer you a contract. Don't sign it. And I thought, wow, that's an odd phone call to get.
Mhm.
And so he said, I'm talking with Jim Lee to become editor in chief of Wildstorm, and I want to bring you over there so I
Nice.
was like, okay. Well, luckily DC, I got lost in the sauce somewhere. No one ever called me to offer me that contract. And so I didn't have to turn it down. Although the day I went in to drop off my last pages to them, I had already told my other editor, my editor in chief, that I was leaving for Wildstorm. So I went up to drop pages off, and he he said, I was in the office. He's like, hold on a minute. He went down to the office, and then he called me down the hall, and he brought me into Archie Goodwin's office. And I'm like, wow, Archie Goodwin, this is like great. And Archie just looked tired, and I realized that he had told Archie that I was leaving for Wildstorm, and DC was really struggling to sort of keep not only talent but particularly inkers at that point. All the comic companies were really, really inker desperate. And Archie just looks up at me and he goes, "Did anyone ever offer you a contract?" And he's like, I said, no. I said, I had heard that they were supposed to. I said, but no one ever reached out to me for the contract. And Archie just did one of these like these deep sighs, whole body sort of sunk in, and he just sort of nodded his head. And he goes, "Well, they should have." And
Mhm.
I was like, "Yeah, they probably should have." And he was nice. He said, "Good luck." Said, "Oh, if you ever change, if it doesn't work out, So, but no, Wildstorm was great. I mean, I can't say enough about how good they were. I mean, it was, got to make some money. And also, too, the thing that people forget is, after that sort of initial wave of books, the industry started to shift, and the sales started to drop, and so it became a much more open company within the first 7 or 8 months I was there.
Mhm.
Because now all of a sudden they weren't so sure what was going to sell and what wasn't, and so they started to take a little chances. So I got opportunities to write and pencil and ink and just do pretty much anything. Jim Lee was really good in that, like, if a creator came to his editor with an idea and the editor thought it was good enough to pass it on to Jim, you know 70-80% of the time it would be greenlit. Like, there was
Mhm.
not a big fear factor that you were going to get rejected, and not every idea went through, but most of them did. So I was constantly pitching stuff, and you know um it was like, I think it was like what comic companies really were sort of aspiring to,
Mhm.
especially when the money was good, in terms of giving their creators enough freedom, but sort of in the confines of this universe that had been set up. Um, and it was just really nice to be having steady work that paid me well. Like, I felt like it was a real job, um, for the first time since maybe I did, when Head and I were working on the Turtles books.
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
the Turtles paid very well too. And again, Kevin Eastman, super great guy, just super generous. Um, but Wildstorm was, I always felt like yeah, I'm still just doing the turtles. Like nothing against the turtles.
Mhm.
Like I said, that turtle work couldn't have come at a better time. We were running out of money working for Dark Horse. My father was starting to give me side eye about working in comics. He actually gave me my first sort of like, maybe this really isn't a real job kind of speech one day.
Mhm.
And,
Mhm.
then like a few months later, my turtle royalty check came in, and then he was like, "Oh, you know, this is okay." So, but I never felt like I was never in love with the turtles. I liked what it gave me. It gave me a broader audience. It gave us, I should say, us, gave us, a decent paycheck,
Mhm.
and they were great to work for. There was almost no editorial control when we were working on the turtle books. Like, you know, I'm still amazed at some of the stuff that Rich got away with when we were doing the books. Like, we did a story, and it cut. Our versions of the turtles were very cartoony, very crazy, very like Ren and Stimpy. It was more parody than anything.
Mhm.
And he
Mhm.
had a scene where he cuts down to the sewer hideout, and the turtles are in some sort of argument over something, and it cuts to, you hear uh, Splinters yelling from his meditation room, to keep the noise down, because he made Splinter basically just like an angry father.
Right.
And then it cuts to the side of the meditation room, and it's the bathroom, and Splinter's sitting on the toilet, and it was hilarious. But for years after that, I had people that worked for Mirage like bring that panel up, like, how did you get away with it? And I'm like, we just did, like, we just drew it, and no one changed it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And yeah, so the Turtles was great for that. But I never felt like it was like a home. I never felt like I wanted to be working on turtle stuff for the rest of my life. um Wildstorm was different. Wildstorm was like, you know this is a great place to work. And but yeah. So
Interesting, interesting things, and yeah, I'd forgotten about Ren and Stimpy, but that's that's a great
yeah.
vibe.
Well, that was a massive influence on both Rich and I. I
Mhm.
mean, less so Ren and Stimpy, more so the New Adventures of Mighty Mouse, which was the cartoon that Ralph Bakshi made with John Kricfalusi before Ren and Stimpy.
Mhm.
And very much so, like I was talking about before, I remember the day Rich Hedden called me up. He had watched it. I didn't. I wasn't really watching Saturday morning cartoons at that point because they were all garbage. And he called me up and he said, "Did you watch the new Mighty Mouse cartoon this morning?" I'm like, "No." It's like, "Well, next week, watch it." And so I started watching it, and it was just bonkers. It was like nothing I had ever seen on TV ever, really. And so it became like a massive influence on both of us, and it definitely bled into our work a lot. And any chance Rich and I got to draw something and make it kind of crazy like that, we would.
Yeah.
Almost to like the fans. I mean, the fans hated our turtle stories. They hated them. And as a matter of fact, our first turtle story we did relatively straight. We did it sort of in the Roachmill style. But the second turtle story was just, straight out Ren and Stimpy. And I remember the woman up there who was sort of our liaison whenever we needed anything. I was talking to her on the phone, and um, for our turtle story, the second one was the first turtle story not to sell. Oh, it didn't crack the 100,000
Mhm.
mark.
Mhm.
So it was like,
Mhm.
woohoo! We're sinking this ship, whether you want it or not. That's what it felt like. And we did with and not only that, but they committed to a 3-part story. So the first part didn't sell over 100,000, and each issue went even down from there. So it was like, yes, I don't think the turtles ever really recovered after we put that torpedo in its side. But no, they did. The fans hated our turtle stories, because it was like they took it very seriously, especially
Mhm.
at that time too, when the turtles were kind of, you know, it, it, I think Kevin made a mistake. He was very generous when he met artists that he liked. He wanted them to work on his book, but I
Mhm.
think he should have kept one. mainstream continuity turtle book drawn by somebody who could do a really good job on it and keep it sort of consistent rather than just doing like 2 and 3 issue story arcs with random artists and letting
Mhm.
them draw it and write it and do whatever they wanted with it, which is what we did. He should have done a separate turtle book, like an imprint that
Mhm.
was the sort of free for all turtle book. And I think it would have done, you know, then fans could have decided whether they wanted to. But they really hated that our stories were in sort of the main, you know, it'd be like all of a sudden if you pick up an issue of Spider-Man and it's just like totally nuts or, or maybe not even Spider-Man because Spider-Man is a little bit of a goofy book, but if you took like a really serious book and, Batman, all of a sudden, it's goofy and, cartoony and more of a spoof of Batman than, you know, and that's what it was. So yeah, fans were pretty, pretty hostile toward it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, these days, what has your creative attention? What are you currently creating? And are there spaces where you share your work and where people can follow along?
Yeah, I mean, I'm on Facebook. I always post, stuff on Facebook, old stuff, new stuff. Like you said earlier, I do a lot of toy design work, so I can't
Mhm.
really share that or talk about it. It's all hush hush until it comes out. And Rich Ed and I are talking about maybe doing something again together, more just for fun. We don't really have a publisher at this point. I don't know if we'll really even be able to get one. The industry has changed so much.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, but doing a side project for Marvel Animation next month, starting that. Can't really talk about the details of it, but it's I I at my age, I don't really feel the sort of driving need to be out there and
Mhm.
you know
Mhm.
certainly I want to get I want to do projects that people see, but that's a little less important than it used to be. Now it's just give me some work that's good, it's satisfying, and toy design it pays very well certainly compared to comics it does.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, so I'm perfectly happy doing that. But we like I said, Rich and I are talking in the phase, maybe just do something and put it online, post it on Facebook and see what people say. But
Well, fantastic, fantastic. I appreciate the time. I appreciate the conversation. Did we miss anything that you want to make sure to share for listeners before we close out?
no, not that I can think of, other than I have webbed toes.
Well, there you go. There you go. I was going to ask, so
I was waiting for that question. Just,
that's right. Usually it's the second one. I kind of tuck it
yeah,
in there. So, well, Tom, thank you again for the time and
no
glad to
problem.
feature you and glad to talk anytime.
All right. Take care.
You too.